We're not too far away from the matchup between the Louisville Cardinals and the Pittsburgh Panthers. The game is still considered to be very, very close in terms of almost being a true toss-up game on many services like Bet Online. It's going to come down to which team can execute more and to the fullest. For the Louisville Cardinals, it's going to be about defending the Pittsburgh rushing attack and more. So on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast, we're going to talk about what Louisville needs to do to come out victorious on Saturday evening. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode is brought to you by Underdog. Sign up on UnderdogFantasy.com with the promo code LOCKEDON and get your first deposit doubled up to $100. As I mentioned, I want to say thank you all, as I always do, for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. Now, as I mentioned, the game between the Louisville Cardinals and the Pittsburgh Panthers is still considered to be a very, very close toss-up game. So for the Louisville Cardinals, it's going to be about matter of executing more so than the Pittsburgh Panthers, obviously. To do that, they're going to need to limit the Pittsburgh rushing attack, get into the opposing backfield, and get the passing game going early. So we're going to talk about the three keys to the game that I feel like if Louisville is able to succeed at, that they will come out victorious on Saturday evening. So let's start with the main one. Pittsburgh's offense coming into the season, there were high hopes for quarterback Kedon Slovis. Those hopes haven't necessarily materialized into a lot of substance on the field. He's struggled here and there. So Pittsburgh and Pat Narduzzi have turned to the rushing attack to carry the Panthers through the first half of the season. Obviously, if you follow college football all over ESPN, it was reported a couple weeks ago during Pittsburgh's matchup with the Virginia Tech Hokies, Israel Abanikanda ran for over 300 yards and recorded 6 touchdowns. Now, granted, Virginia Tech is one of, if not the worst team in the ACC. It's still very, very impressive, right, for a running back to run for over 300 yards and find the end zone 6 times. So, when we did the crossover podcast on yesterday's show with Locked On Pitt host Nick Faribault, he came out and basically said that, hey, look, Pittsburgh has essentially tried to establish the run in each and every game this season, and it has a direct correlation with how much overall success the Pittsburgh offense has. When you look at their schedule and what they were able to do when they ran the ball well against teams like Virginia Tech, Rhode Island, Western Michigan, and even Tennessee, they look solid. They took Tennessee down to the wire, lost in overtime, and then when they didn't necessarily rush the ball well, they struggled, beat West Virginia by 7, and then lost to Georgia Tech back on October 1st, the game after the Yellow Jackets fired Jeff Collins. They weren't able to get the rushing attack going and really kind of got caught out of their element and weren't really able to supplement the offensive woes with the passing game. And so Pittsburgh has really made it a point in each and every game to establish the rushing attack. Israel Abanikanda is one of the best running backs in the ACC. Obviously, one of the games kind of skewed the statistics a little bit, but he is averaging 6.4 yards per carry, 830 total yards on the season, 12 touchdowns on the ground, which is incredible. Factor in also that the Panthers return Rodney Hammond Jr., a 5'9 sophomore that Nick Faribault compared to a former Pittsburgh Panther of the past, Dion Lewis, who played for the New England Patriots for a handful of years, and also I believe the Tennessee Titans as well. Smaller running back that does a good job of using his low center of gravity and a solid ability to, kind of shed off that first tackle and get some yards after the catch. After the rush. So I think for Louisville in the first, key to the game, I think it is directly trying to limit what Pittsburgh is going to come into this game and try to do. Yes, Louisville's passing defense is vulnerable, to say the least, and we'll talk about that in the second segment. I still think Pittsburgh is going to stay true to their MO that they've tried to develop early on in the season, and that is get the rushing attack going. Because when the rushing attack is going, they feel like then Kedon Slovis has that pressure taken off of him. You have that ability to kind of utilize that now. So I think at the end of the day, it's an instance to where look. It's going to be tough to do so. Pittsburgh, I believe, has a top 40 rushing attack. Now, Louisville is in the top 20. Granted, that can be contributed a lot to having a dual threat quarterback as well. So that fits into the mix. But Israel Abanikanda is a player that I've been thoroughly impressed with throughout the entirety of this season. One thing that I like to do over the course of the season is watch Louisville's future opponents, just so it gets me in a spot to where I feel like I'm in a comfortable headspace to analyze a certain team, because I've watched them a couple times. So I've come away not necessarily totally impressed with the Pittsburgh offense, although I do think Jared Wayne is one heck of a receiver. But Israel Abanikanda seems to be really the focal point of that offense, especially with Rodney Hammond out. Now they have both of those guys back. Abanikanda is coming off the best game of his career, possibly, if not the best rushing performance in Pittsburgh history, one of the best in Division I history. So I think at the end of the day for Louisville, defensively, it's going to be a challenge, right? I think that goes without saying. I don't necessarily think Louisville fans need to be convinced that the overall defensive aspect is going to be an issue. I think that Louisville's defense is very solid up front, and that gives me some hope, although the Louisville rushing defense isn't necessarily as good as it was last year at times. I still feel like they've done a good job at times. Florida State, who came into that third weekend of the season leading the ACC in rushing at the time, I felt like it was the Florida State passing attack that really took Louisville down. Granted, Boston College, not really good at passing, or not really good at running the ball at all. They kind of gashed the Louisville defense, but Virginia, the Cardinals held Virginia to 6 rushing yards. And not to mention, I think that Pittsburgh has a pretty decent offensive line as well. Scott Satterfield said in his weekly press conference that Pittsburgh has the best offensive line that Louisville will have faced to date, which I think is very high praise. Now, maybe some of that is coach speak, but when you throw it up against the likes of Central Florida, even some other offensive lines that the team has played, I think that is pretty high praise. So ultimately, I think at the end of the day, Israel Abanikanda is kind of the number one player to watch for Pittsburgh, because if you allow him to get going, there's no telling what can happen. And I think that it's kind of a yin and a yang, because if you give the rushing attack the space it needs and you allow the Pittsburgh rushing attack to get going, then you kind of you open it up and leave spots on the field for Kedon Slovis to make some comfortable throws. And maybe you're loading the box and you give Pittsburgh some opportunities to utilize the passing attack, and then vice versa. We'll talk about here in a minute. If you allow that Pittsburgh passing attack to get going, Nick Faribault said it best. You're really, really playing with fire, so to speak, because that's kind of the one area of the offense that is lacking. But in the past couple seasons, Louisville has really done a good job of handling premier ball carriers. Maybe not necessarily Sean Tucker in week 1 against Syracuse this year, but Sean Tucker last year for Syracuse, Mateo Durant for Duke, Jerion Ely in the first game against Mississippi. You had Isaiah Bowser in that game against Central Florida last year, so on and so forth, right? So I think that it's going to be a matter of not necessarily shutting the rushing attack down, because that's easier said than done. And, I don't want to say that if Louisville doesn't shut down the rushing attack that they won't win. I think it will just go a long way if you don't allow Israel Abanikanda to, get to 150 yards or average over 5 yards per carry. If you can get them in third and long situations, really force them to go into uncomfortable situations where they have to throw the ball in third and long. I think that that's the first key to the defensive game plan. That is to obviously attack the Pittsburgh strength head on, and that is the rushing attack led by possible all ACC honoree Israel Abanikanda. So, like I mentioned, though, throughout that first segment, getting into the opposing backfield and making life tough for Kedon Slovis is also a key to the game. We're going to go a little bit more in depth into that here in just a second after we talk about our friends and the title sponsor of the show, Underdog Fantasy. It's the easiest place to spice up the college football season. You can create an account and look at the different pick'em choices for your team each week. The players that I like in this one, I like Tyler Van Dyke, the Miami quarterback, higher than 240.5 passing yards this week. I like Will Mallory, higher than 55.5 receiving yards. I also like Virginia Tech's Caleb Smith, higher than 65.5 receiving yards. You can go to underdogfantasy.com to check out all of the odds that it has on all of the Louisville players. It's easy to play and available in 30 states. Just pick between 2 to 5 players across any team, not just the Cardinals, and decide if they will finish higher or lower. It's one of the easiest fantasy to play games out there, and you can win cold hard cash in a single game. Sign up with the promo code LOCKEDON, all one word, and Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100. Once again, that's deposit $100, get $100 for free. Go to underdogfantasy.com or find the Underdog Fantasy app in the App Store or Google Play. That's Underdog Fantasy with the promo code LOCKEDON, all one word. Make sure to get in on the college football pick'em action today. So like I mentioned, Kedon Slovis hasn't necessarily impressed me all that much this year. Nick Faribault said on the Crossover podcast that you can find on all streaming services, hasn't really lived up to the expectations that the Pittsburgh fan base and the media put on him coming into the season. He's 91 of 148 for a 61.5 completion percentage, 1,167 yards, only 5 passing touchdowns to 3 interceptions. He's been sacked 10 times. And is averaging 7.9 yards per completion. So like I mentioned, Jared Wayne, a very solid receiver. He's going to be a player that Wesley McGriff and company in that secondary are going to have to focus on. The 6'3" senior receiver from Ontario has 23 catches for 390 yards and a touchdown, averaging 17 yards per catch. But like I mentioned, I think that this is a Louisville defense that has really been solid getting after the passer. They're tied for third in the nation in total sacks. Going into last week before the bye, they had the most total sack yards in the country. Factor in a handful of tackles for loss. I mean, they've had multiple games this season where they've recorded over 10 tackles for loss. So we're obviously seeing a huge improvement from last year to the first 6 games of this season. So it's going to be very critical in that regard to not only try to get some tackles for loss, get into the opposing backfield for the opposing ball carriers, but also taking advantage of a Pittsburgh offensive line that will not return their starting left tackle, who has been out for some time, and he is out for the season. So this is going to be a matchup where I'm really, really looking forward to see how guys like Yaya Diaby and Ashton end up doing in this matchup, because an opportunity for them, although they're going up against one of the better offensive lines that they'll face all season, I think it's an opportunity for them to really force Kedon Slovis into uncomfortable situations to where he's at the very least having to go through his reads just a split second quicker, forcing his decisions just a split second quicker, and forcing him to make mistakes. That's one thing that Louisville's been a lot better at this season than last season, but unfortunately, they really haven't been able to capitalize on that, but that is a conversation for a different time. Getting into the opposing backfield and forcing Pittsburgh into situations to where, you're recording sacks, you're forcing turnovers, at the very least, in my opinion, third and long situations to where you force Pittsburgh to throw the ball considerably down the field. I mean, if you're giving them, less than 3rd and 5 here and there, you have the option to pick that up on the ground, shorter than 5 yards, slant routes to where, Kedon Slovis doesn't have to do too much. But the the game plan for the Louisville Cardinals defense should be to force Kedon Slovis to win this game for Pat Narduzzi. Because I feel like this is a opportunity for the team really to just go into this matchup and do what you haven't been able to do in weeks prior. You've gone up against teams that do one thing extremely well, but don't do another thing extremely well. I mean, you look at Florida State, who a decent passing team, but they were a great rushing attack and had a backup quarterback, and that backup quarterback really made some big time plays. Boston College was trending in the wrong direction. The rushing attack was one of the worst in the country. And you were allowing Boston College not only to get big passing plays through the air, but also on the ground as well. Virginia, you made one-dimensional, although they really weren't as much as they were last season. But overall, I think that Louisville's best chance to win this game is if you get Pittsburgh in situations to where they're not showing a ton of success by being in. You look back at that game against Georgia Tech. When I watched that game, the defense made it tough for the rushing attack, and they forced Kedon Slovis to go out and win the game, and he was not able to do so. Tennessee's a good team. It is what it is. But outside of that, Pittsburgh really hasn't been tested all that much outside of the Tennessee game because, they've played West Virginia, Western Michigan, Rhode Island, Georgia Tech, and Virginia Tech. They lost two of those games, Tennessee and Georgia Tech, but they haven't really gone up against a solid ACC opponent yet. That kind of changes after this week when they have a game against North Carolina and Syracuse. So there's a lot of opportunity here for the Louisville defense, and I really do think that we're going to see some improvement in the second half of the season from the rushing defense. I think it's getting better. Obviously, the technique from tackling has to get better. And then the schematic system that they're playing in terms of the back half of the defense and the secondary is going to have to be altered as well. But like I mentioned, you can go check that out on the previous episode on the last night's show, the bonus episode, talking about what I want to see from the Louisville defense moving forward in the second half of the season. So as I mentioned, limiting the rushing attack for Pittsburgh will then kind of lead into the second point, because then you have to really make life tough for Kedon Slovis. Obviously, you can kind of come into this argument and say, look, it's kind of tying things up on the secondary, making sure you're not giving up the big play, and that is 100% valid. But I think that it should be a matter of making Slovis uncomfortable, putting him in third and long situations to where you're forcing him time and time again to get it done and to convert on third and long, and that's just kind of a tough thing to do, despite Louisville being susceptible to giving up those big plays. So I think it's kind of a combined effort. So you can kind of combine 1 and 2 to an overall game plan, in my opinion, and that's going to be able to help Louisville's defense in this one. But like I mentioned, Louisville's offense also going to have to really zone in here as well, because they're going up against a Pittsburgh defense that's solid and one of the brightest defensive minds in the ACC in head coach Pat Narduzzi. We're going to talk about that here in more in depth here in just a second. Before we do that, I want to say thank you all once again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, including YouTube and WHAS 11 Plus, 5 days a week. Your team every day. So the Louisville offense, I don't want to say they've been pedestrian this season, because the rushing attack is top 20 in the country. So that is obviously something to celebrate and to acknowledge and give credit to. But the passing attack definitely has not lived up to the hype. And that's something that you can kind of see why, one of the factors of why this team is 3-3. The passing attack has been pedestrian, but it's kind of head scratching because the offensive line has been solid. They protected Malik Cunningham. They've created holes for the running backs. You also have, a solid receiving core. But overall after that, I think it's a slew of things. It is, maybe Malik Cunningham not necessarily being as accurate as you would hope. You also have, penalties that have ruined drives. They've derailed drives. The team is kind of middle of the pack in the country when it comes to converting in the red zone. So that's another thing to focus on. But ultimately, I think that the third key to the game here for Louisville is to get the passing attack going. Look, the Louisville rushing attack has been solid. I don't want to come on this podcast every single week and say the key to the game, get the rushing attack going, get the rushing attack going, get the rushing attack going. That goes without saying because that opens up the passing game. But I think that this game in particular is an opportunity that Louisville needs to take advantage of and get that passing attack going, because at the end of the day, the rushing attack is top 20 in the country. Malik Cunningham has shown that he's getting better and better when it comes to feeling more comfortable in RPO situations. Tyon Evans is back healthy. Jalen Mitchell is back healthy. Travion Cooley is back after a solid performance against Virginia. Jawar Jordan healthy. You finally have a healthy running back committee. But after that, right, it's a matter of getting the passing attack going. Now, there's rumors out there that Huggins-Bruce may not necessarily be available for Pittsburgh. I'm not necessarily going to address that because I don't know. It's kind of seemingly one of those things that Louisville and Scott Satterfield is keeping close to chest, right? Hey, the focus on now is getting the ball out to your playmakers, getting the passing game going. I would like to see Malik Cunningham, get his confidence going in the first drive to where they're throwing the ball like they did against UCF, like they did against Florida State. Or not against Florida State, I'm sorry, Boston College. Louisville's offense has done a good job in the first drives of games. It's been adjusting when other teams make some changes on defense, and I want to see Louisville's passing game kind of come to life right from the very beginning, and I think they can do so by getting the ball to guys that have been security blankets over the years, getting the ball to guys like Marshawn Ford, to Braden Smith, Tyler Hudson. Those are the guys, those three I'm looking at in particular to get the ball to. Marshawn Ford looked really, really solid. He's very, very reliable. We saw that when Brock Doman started at quarterback against Virginia. I think that the passing attack looks solid. Getting Marshawn Ford available or getting Marshawn Ford involved. He's very available when it comes to being a pass catcher because he's walking mismatch. Like I said, he's very, very quick for opposing linebackers to be able to guard, and he's very big for opposing defensive backs to guard. So I would like to see, rollout situations to where you're allowing Malik Cunningham to make decisions with his legs, but even that can kind of be a little bit predictable because that's something that Louisville goes to a lot. I want to see Malik Cunningham deliver good throws in the pocket. Louisville's offensive line is going to have to protect Malik, considering that yes, Louisville's defense does a good job with getting after the quarterback, but Pittsburgh is number 12 in the country, averaging just over 3 sacks per game. So that's also something to focus on. Malik Cunningham has been very, very successful in years past when he has had a clean pocket. So something to focus on there. But the passing attack is just as important, if not more important, than the rushing attack because Louisville's opponents seem to play off the rush, forcing Louisville to, extend drives, go on the long drives, and obviously chunk plays definitely help out with that. But the passing attack is something that coming into the last half of the season, I want to see it get going more. There's no reason why it should be as pedestrian as it is currently. I'm sorry, but there's no reason it should be. This passing attack should be so much better because you have all the pieces. You have a quarterback that has been in this system for many years. You have solid receivers. You have a tight end that's one of the best in the country. You have a very solid offensive, veteran-led offensive line. So, and that also comes back to play calling as well, devising plays where you're getting, guys separation. Mainly going to be the intermediate routes. I understand maybe you don't necessarily have that deep threat that you've had in years past, like Tyler Harrell, like Jordan Watkins. And if Amari Huggins-Bruce is out, then you lose another home run threat in the receiving core, but there's no guarantee there that he's going to be out. It seems like that's kind of up in the air. But I would like to see the passing attack really get developed in this one to not only be able to help you in this game, but go a long way in giving Malik Cunningham some confidence for the rest of the season. Because let's be honest, if Louisville wants to get to bowl eligibility to 6 wins in this season, they're going to have to develop that passing attack because you have some very solid defense that you're going up against in this last half of the season. James Madison has a solid defense. Clemson, you're playing them on the road, solid defense. Kentucky has a solid defense, so on and so forth. So I think that these keys to the game not only are going to help in this game, but also when it comes to getting the team going for the rest of the season, because they're not only going to have to win this game, but they're going to have to do some big things for the season, in its entirety remaining. So keys to the game for Louisville: limit the Pittsburgh rushing attack led by Israel Abanikanda and Rodney Hammond Jr. Force Kedon Slovis into third and long situations to where he is having to make some tough throws, get after the opposing quarterback, get into the opposing backfield, and then offensively get the passing game going. Protect Malik Cunningham, allow him a clean pocket to throw, and overall, hopefully Louisville will come out victorious. Next week, we will obviously break down the performance that the Louisville Cardinals have on Saturday evening against the Panthers on homecoming weekend, and then we'll do some basketball talk as well. So at this point, let's also take this time to give a shout out to the Locked On ACC podcast. There's no better way to get your conference news than that podcast hosted by Candace Cooper. Also available 5 days a week on all streaming services. But that's going to wrap up this Friday edition of the show. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here on Monday.